Today, much of the world no longer sees the United States and Britain as natural leaders. While Western media still frames global politics as a battle between freedom and authoritarianism, billions of people across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East are making a far more practical calculation. Who actually shows up? Who builds? Who delivers? And who leaves behind chaos wrapped in speeches about democracy? For decades, Washington and London positioned themselves as the guardians of the global order, the protectors of human rights, the architects of development. But in much of the developing world, that story never matched lived reality. What people experienced instead were wars that destroyed infrastructure, loans that trapped governments in endless repayment cycles, trade systems that extracted wealth while promising growth that never came. So when China began arriving with ports, highways, power plants, rail lines, and financing with fewer political lectures attached, something shifted. Not because China is perfect, but because the West had already exhausted its credibility. Trust is not built on values printed in policy documents. It is built on memory, on experience, on what actually happened when power was exercised. And for much of the world, the memory of Western leadership is not prosperity. It is disruption. To understand why so many countries are choosing China over the US and Britain today, you have to rewind far beyond modern headlines. You have to return to the foundations of the global system itself. By the early 20th century, Britain and other European powers had carved up most of the planet. Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and large parts of Latin America were reshaped to serve foreign empires. Colonies were not built to develop local economies. They were built to extract. Railways ran from mines to ports, not between cities. Farms produced export crops instead of food for local populations. Borders were drawn to control people, not to create stable nations. Wealth flowed outward, control flowed inward. When formal colonial rule ended after World War II, the structure of dependence remained. Newly independent nations still relied on exporting raw materials to Western markets, still borrowed from Western-controlled financial institutions, still operated inside trade systems designed decades earlier for imperial benefit. Political freedom arrived. Economic freedom did not. And when many of these countries tried to break out of that structure, the response was rarely supportive. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and Britain repeatedly intervened across the developing world. Governments were overthrown. Leaders were replaced. Civil wars were fueled, all in the name of stability, anti-communism, or protecting strategic interests, from Iran to Guatemala, from Congo to Chile, from Vietnam to Iraq, from Libya to Afghanistan. The pattern was consistent. Western powers spoke about democracy, then backed coups when elections produced the wrong outcome, spoke about sovereignty, then violated it when resources or influence were at stake. When countries ran into debt crises, they turned to institutions dominated by the US and Britain for help. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, Western development agencies. The money came, but so did conditions. Public spending cuts, opening domestic markets to foreign corporations, reducing subsidies for food, fuel, and healthcare. These reforms were sold as modernization. In practice, they frequently shrank local economies, increased unemployment, weakened public services, and transferred national assets to multinational companies. Entire generations felt poorer after the help arrived. Hospitals became underfunded. Schools deteriorated. Basic services disappeared. So when Western leaders spoke about partnership and development, many countries heard something else: control, interference, and sacrifice demanded from the poorest. This history never vanished. It became the background against which every new Western initiative was judged. Then, in the early 2000s, China began expanding its presence across the developing world. Not with military bases, not with regime change, but with construction crews. Chinese companies started building highways across Kenya, ports in Pakistan, railways in Ethiopia, power stations in Nigeria, industrial zones in Southeast Asia, Projects that Western institutions had debated for decades suddenly materialized in a few years. And crucially, China approached these deals differently. There were no long lists of political reforms attached, no demands to restructure entire economies, no public lectures about governance models. The message was straightforward. We finance infrastructure. You repay the loan. We trade. We cooperate. For countries used to being treated like policy experiments, this felt radically different. It felt like being treated as a partner rather than a problem to be fixed. China framed its own history as part of this shared experience. A country once carved up by foreign powers, humiliated, exploited, forced into unequal treaties. A nation that rebuilt itself through development rather than external instruction. That narrative resonated, not because China was suddenly seen as benevolent, but because it understood what it meant to be on the receiving end of Western dominance. And it offered an alternative path, one centered on growth first, infrastructure first, stability first. By the time the Belt and Road Initiative formally launched in 2013, dozens of countries were already deeply engaged with Chinese financing, roads that cut travel times in half, ports that expanded exports, electric grids that finally reached rural regions, industrial zones that created manufacturing jobs. These were tangible changes people could see, not policy promises, not development seminars, concrete, steel, electricity, trade. And while critics in the West warned about debt risks and geopolitical influence, many developing nations quietly compared this reality to decades of Western involvement. One side delivered visible growth. The other delivered conditions, instability, and delayed progress. For governments under pressure to raise living standards quickly, the choice became increasingly practical, not ideological, not moral, practical. Who helps us build now? And who keeps telling us to wait? This shift did not happen because China replaced the West as a savior. It happened because the West never truly delivered on its promises of shared prosperity. And as China's presence expanded, countries finally had options. For the first time in generations, they were no longer dependent on a single power center for loans, trade, and development. That leverage changed everything. And it marked the beginning of a global realignment that continues to accelerate today. What makes this shift even more powerful is not just what China offers, but what the Western model failed to provide. For decades, development in much of the world followed a familiar pattern. A country would face economic trouble. It would seek help from Western-backed institutions. Money would arrive, but only after agreeing to sweeping structural changes. Governments were told to shrink themselves, cut social programs, sell public utilities, open domestic markets to foreign competition, remove protections for local industries. The theory was simple. Free markets would bring efficiency. Foreign investment would drive growth. Prosperity would trickle down. But for many countries, the results looked very different. Local factories closed when cheaper imports flooded in. Public services deteriorated when budgets were slashed. Jobs disappeared faster than new ones were created. Economic control quietly shifted outward. Instead of colonial administrators, decisions were now shaped by creditors, rating agencies, and foreign investors. Sovereignty existed on paper, but economic policy was increasingly written elsewhere. This is why Western advice began to feel less like partnership and more like supervision. Entire societies were asked to endure pain today for growth that might arrive tomorrow that often never came. Now compare that with how China approached development finance. Chinese loans focus heavily on large physical projects, transportation networks, energy generation, ports and logistics hubs, industrial parks, the foundations of economic activity. Instead of demanding economic restructuring first, China built capacity first. The logic was straightforward. You cannot grow manufacturing without electricity. You cannot expand trade without roads and ports. You cannot attract investment without reliable infrastructure. Where Western programs emphasize policy reform, China emphasized construction and speed. Projects that might take a decade of studies under Western institutions often broke ground within months under Chinese financing. For governments under pressure to deliver visible improvements, this mattered enormously. A new highway could cut food prices. A port expansion could double exports. A power plant could bring entire regions online. These were political wins, economic wins, and social wins all at once. China also worked through state-owned firms that coordinated financing, engineering, and construction under one system. This reduced bureaucracy, reduced delays, and ensured projects actually got completed. While Western development often fragmented responsibility across consultants, donors, contractors, and oversight agencies, China offered a turnkey model: one partner, one timeline, one visible result. Of course, this efficiency came with trade-offs: environmental concerns, labor standards, debt risks. These issues are real. But from the perspective of countries that had waited generations for development breakthroughs, perfection was not the priority. Progress was. Another crucial difference was dignity. Western development discourse often framed recipient countries as broken systems needing correction, corrupt, inefficient, backward. China's language was different. It spoke of shared struggle, shared development paths, shared experience of poverty and rebuilding. This psychological shift mattered. Nations that had spent decades being lectured suddenly felt respected, not judged, not managed, but engaged as equals pursuing mutual benefit. That sense of respect built political goodwill far beyond the financial terms of any loan. It made cooperation feel voluntary rather than imposed. And when people feel respected, they are far more willing to tolerate risk. This is why the accusation of so-called debt trap diplomacy resonates far less in many developing countries than it does in Western media. Leaders are fully aware of debt risks. They are not naive. But they also compare those risks against the stagnation that defined decades of Western-led development. A loan that builds a port capable of transforming exports can feel worth the gamble. A highway that unlocks national markets can feel like a lifeline. A power grid that enables industry can feel like the foundation of independence. Debt tied to visible growth looks very different from debt tied to austerity. That distinction shapes perception. It shapes political alignment. And it shapes trust. There is also the issue of consistency. Western policy toward developing nations has often shifted with elections, public opinion, and strategic priorities. Aid arrives one decade, sanctions the next, support during one conflict, abandonment during another. Countries that align closely with Western interests sometimes found themselves discarded when those interests changed. China's approach has been far more predictable. As China's role expanded across the developing world, a new narrative began to dominate Western headlines: debt, influence, dependence. The claim was simple. China was lending deliberately, knowing countries would struggle to repay, so it could seize assets and control strategic infrastructure, ports, railways, energy grids. This idea spread rapidly, but the reality on the ground has proven far more complex. Most countries borrowing from China are not collapsing because of Chinese loans alone. Their debt problems usually stem from a mix of global shocks, commodity price swings, currency crashes, legacy Western debt, and domestic challenges. In many cases, Chinese lending represents only a portion of total obligations. And when repayment difficulties arise, China has frequently renegotiated terms, extended maturities, paused payments, or restructured loans rather than immediately seizing assets. This doesn't mean the risks aren't real. Debt is still debt. Poorly planned projects still fail. Corruption still exists. But the simplistic image of a deliberate global trap ignores the broader financial reality most developing countries already lived in long before China arrived. For decades, they were deeply indebted to Western lenders under far harsher conditions. What changed was not the presence of debt. It was the presence of an alternative source of financing. For the first time, countries could negotiate. They could compare offers. They could push for better terms. They could walk away from some Western demands because another partner existed. This bargaining power alone transformed development politics. Competition among lenders meant countries were no longer forced into a single rigid model. Western institutions quietly softened some of their policies as Chinese finance expanded. Loan conditions became more flexible. Infrastructure funding increased. Project timelines accelerated. Not out of generosity, out of necessity. China changed the game simply by showing up. But there is a deeper shift happening beneath the financial surface. China's engagement is not just about individual projects. It is about reshaping global trade networks. New shipping routes connect Africa directly to Asia. Rail corridors link inland economies to global markets. Industrial zones integrate developing countries into manufacturing supply chains. This is how long-term economic power is built. Not through speeches, through logistics, through production, through connectivity. For many nations, this offers something Western-led globalization never fully delivered. A chance to move beyond exporting raw materials. A chance to industrialize. A chance to climb the value chain. Instead of selling unprocessed minerals, countries can host factories. Instead of exporting crops cheaply, they can process food domestically. Instead of relying on commodity booms, they can diversify. This aspiration sits at the heart of why China's model resonates. It mirrors how China itself rose. Infrastructure first, manufacturing next, trade integration after, gradual wealth accumulation over time. Many leaders see this not as Chinese dominance, but as a roadmap for development, a practical example of what worked. Meanwhile, Western economies increasingly shifted toward finance and services, leaving fewer clear industrial pathways for poorer nations to follow. Advice focused on liberalization rather than production, markets rather than factories, consumption rather than capacity. China offered a different emphasis. Build the physical economy, then let growth follow. Another powerful factor driving alignment is geopolitical fatigue. For decades, global politics revolved around Western priorities, security alliances, military interventions, sanctions regimes, political pressure campaigns. Many developing countries found themselves repeatedly caught in these power struggles, forced to choose sides, punished when they didn't, disrupted when conflicts erupted. China's rise offers an alternative pole in the global system, not one rooted primarily in military blocs, but in economic networks. This multipolar world gives smaller countries room to maneuver. They can trade with China, cooperate with Europe, maintain ties with the U.S., rather than exist under a single dominant authority. This strategic flexibility is enormously appealing. It reduces vulnerability, increases leverage, and limits exposure to sudden policy shifts from any one superpower. It also aligns with how most governments actually think. They are not ideological crusaders. They are managers of stability, growth, employment, social calm. China's approach directly targets these priorities. Factories create jobs. Infrastructure lowers costs. Trade expands revenue. Economic momentum strengthens governments. As this realignment continues, it is tempting to frame it as a moral shift, as if countries are abandoning democratic ideals in favor of authoritarian influence. But for much of the world, this was never about ideology. It was about credibility. It was about who actually helped improve daily life. It was about who respected sovereignty instead of reshaping nations to fit external interests. And it was about who delivered tangible progress instead of endless promises. For generations, the United States and Britain positioned themselves as architects of global prosperity. Yet the lived experience across large parts of the developing world told a different story. Wars justified by values that left countries in ruins. Economic programs that demanded sacrifice without delivering growth. Partnerships that felt more like supervision. When China entered this landscape, it did not arrive as a savior. It arrived as an alternative to conditional loans, an alternative to political interference, an alternative to development that prioritized theory over infrastructure. And in a world where most countries are still fighting basic poverty, unemployment, and instability, that alternative proved powerful. This is why so many nations now work closely with China, while maintaining distance from Western pressure. Not because they believe China is flawless, but because they believe China is practical. China builds first, trades consistently, avoids public moral crusades, and treats cooperation as transactional rather than ideological. For governments under constant pressure to deliver economic results, this approach aligns far better with reality. Growth creates stability. Stability allows reform. Prosperity expands opportunity. The Western model often tried to reverse this order. Change politics first, then hope growth followed. For many countries, that experiment produced disruption instead of development. As China's global footprint expands, non-interference will become harder to maintain. Interests will clash, mistakes will occur, tensions will grow. But the broader direction is already clear. The developing world is no longer willing to live under a single Western-dominated system. It wants options. It wants leverage. It wants partners that deliver. China offers all three. And in doing so, it has fundamentally altered the balance of global influence. This is not a sudden overthrow of the old order. It is a slow replacement, built through infrastructure rather than invasion, through trade rather than treaties, through development rather than domination. For the United States and Britain, the lesson is uncomfortable but simple. Influence cannot be maintained through rhetoric alone. Values lose power when outcomes disappoint. Trust evaporates when experience contradicts promises. The world is not rejecting the West because of propaganda. It is responding to history, to memory, to what actually happened when Western leadership shaped their countries. China did not create this opening. The West did. By decades of intervention, by development models that failed to deliver broad prosperity, by prioritizing control over partnership, China merely stepped into the space that was left behind. And it did so with a strategy focused on growth, infrastructure, and economic integration. This is why countries are choosing China over the US and Britain. Not out of loyalty, not out of ideology, but out of lived experience. In the end, global powers always follow those who build the future people actually want to live in, not those who lecture about how it should look. And as the world continues to change, the nations that deliver tangible progress will shape the next era of influence. The shift we are witnessing today is not a betrayal of values. It is a recalculation based on results. History is moving in the direction of those who show up, invest, and build. And for much of the world, China is doing exactly that. If you want more clear, grounded breakdowns of how global power is really shifting, subscribe for future videos.